My name is Diane Kowalski. I'm 37 years old. 11 months ago, I was sitting on my bathroom floor at 2 in the morning with my laptop open on the tile beside me, looking at a Wisconsin business entity registration filed with the Department of Financial Institutions 8 weeks after my husband's funeral, listing Thomas Andrew Kowalski as the registered owner and primary officer of a limited liability company called Kowalski Premier Flooring. And I want to be very precise about the next thing I tell you, because precision is the whole of what this story is built on. Thomas Andrew Kowalski had been dead for 8 weeks when that filing was made. My husband, who had spent 14 years building a flooring installation business under his own name, who had died of a brain aneurysm on a Tuesday morning in March, while eating breakfast at our kitchen table, had apparently found the time between dying and being buried to register a new company and name his father as the company's secondary officer and his brother as operations director. Before I tell you what I did about it, take a second to like and subscribe, but only if this story actually earns it. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one, and I want to know who is sitting with this tonight. Let me take you back to Thomas first, because none of what happened makes sense without understanding what he built and why someone else wanted it badly enough to steal it from a widow who was still learning how to sleep on her side of the bed. Thomas was a flooring contractor. I know that sounds modest, and I am telling you it was not modest at all. He had started at 19 with a used tile, saw his uncle sold him for $200, and a willingness to work longer hours than anyone else bidding on the same jobs. And by the time we met, when he was 28 and I was 26, and we were both at a friend's backyard party in Milwaukee, where he spent 20 minutes telling me about the difference between engineered hardwood and solid hardwood, with a level of genuine enthusiasm that should have been boring but was somehow completely compelling. He had 6 full-time employees and a client list that included 3 commercial property management companies and a hotel renovation contractor that kept him on retainer. We married 2 years later. We bought a house. We had a daughter, Nora, who is now 7 years old and has her father's exact laugh, the specific one that came from somewhere low and surprised you every time. Thomas Kowalski Flooring, the original business, was a sole proprietorship that Thomas had never bothered converting to an LLC because he was a man who understood flooring with absolute clarity and understood legal structures with approximately none. And the business ran on his personal contractor's license, his reputation, his relationships, and his specific way of showing up to every job site himself to check the work even when he had a full crew there. His clients trusted him personally, not the business name, him. When he died that Tuesday morning in March, what he left behind was not a set of transferable systems or a documented client acquisition process. It was a name and a reputation and 14 years of relationships that were attached to that name so completely that every commercial client he had called me within the first 2 weeks to express condolences, and also, gently, to ask what was going to happen to the business and whether jobs already contracted would be completed. I answered every one of those calls. I am not a contractor. I have a background in administrative management and had spent the previous 4 years working part-time for a nonprofit while also managing Thomas's scheduling, invoicing, and client communication, because Thomas was magnificent on a job site and genuinely terrible at returning emails. I knew his business. I knew his clients. I knew his crews. What I did not know, in those first terrible weeks of answering calls and managing Nora and learning how grief interacts with every ordinary task, until even making coffee feels like something you have to remind yourself to do, was that my in-laws had been watching the business situation very carefully and had formed their own conclusions about what should happen to it. Victor and Marlene Kowalski, Thomas's parents, are the kind of people who have strong opinions about everything and the specific confidence of a family that has always operated as a unit, everyone inside the circle following the same instincts, everyone outside the circle slightly irrelevant to the primary decision-making. Thomas was the second of 3 sons. His older brother Dennis ran a small auto parts business. His younger brother Craig, 29 and recently unemployed after a warehouse closed, had been living in Victor and Marlene's basement for 8 months, and had developed in that time a detailed interest in Thomas's flooring business that Thomas had mentioned to me once with a laugh and once with mild irritation, because Craig had started showing up at job sites offering opinions on technique he was not qualified to have. I had always maintained a careful, polite relationship with the Kowalskis. Not warm, exactly. Thomas and I had built our life with some deliberate distance from his family, not out of conflict, but out of the specific self-preservation that becomes necessary when you marry into a family that has a strong gravitational pull and a tendency to absorb individual people back into the collective if you let the perimeter get too soft. Thomas understood this about his family and had been, over 14 years, the buffer that made my relationship with them manageable. When he died, the buffer died with him, and I did not fully understand until several months later what that was going to cost me. In the weeks after the funeral, Victor and Marlene were present in the way families are present, bringing food, sitting with Nora, calling regularly. Craig came with them occasionally and was quieter than usual, which I registered without thinking much about it. Dennis's wife organized a meal train. Marlene offered to help with paperwork, a broad offer I thanked her for without taking her up on it, because I had a very specific need to manage my own affairs, and grief was not going to change that about me. What I did not know was that the conversations happening among the Kowalskis in those weeks were not primarily about grief. They were about the client list, the contractor relationships, the license question, the employees. They were about what was salvageable and who should do the salvaging. I know this now because Craig's girlfriend at the time, a woman named Sarah, who is no longer Craig's girlfriend, and who reached out to me through a mutual contact 7 months into this whole situation, told me she had been present for multiple kitchen table conversations at Victor and Marlene's house in the month after Thomas died. Conversations in which Victor argued that the family should step in to protect Thomas's business legacy, and Craig argued that he could run the operation if the client relationships could be transferred, and Marlene said that I, the widow, was too emotional and too inexperienced to handle what needed to happen, and that moving fast was important before I made decisions that couldn't be undone. Moving fast. I think about those 2 words a lot. They moved fast. 6 weeks after the funeral, the Wisconsin DFI received a registration for Kowalski Premier Flooring LLC. Thomas listed as owner and registered agent. Victor listed as secondary officer. Craig listed as operations director. The registered address was Victor and Marlene's house, not Thomas and my house, not the address associated with Thomas Kowalski Flooring, but the Kowalski family home on the east side where Craig had been living in the basement. The filing was processed automatically, because business registrations in Wisconsin do not require proof that the named owner is alive, and whoever prepared the documents knew enough about Thomas's identifying information, his date of birth, the last 4 of his social, his contractor license number, to fill the required fields convincingly. I found this at 2 in the morning because of a Google alert. I had set up a Google alert for Thomas's name shortly after his death, one of those small, slightly irrational things you do in grief when you want some mechanism for staying connected to a person who is no longer generating new information in the world. And 8 weeks after the funeral, that alert returned a result from the Wisconsin DFI's public business registration database, a new LLC with my husband's name on it, filed the previous day, with a grand opening event announced on a Facebook page that had been created the same afternoon. Kowalski Premier Flooring, family-owned flooring solutions serving the greater Milwaukee area. Grand opening ribbon cutting tomorrow at 10 a.m. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. They had planned a grand opening for the business they had registered in my dead husband's name, and they had not told me. They had scheduled it for 11 months after his death, and had not made a single call, sent a single text, written a single message to the woman who had been married to the man whose name was on the filing. I sat on the bathroom floor for a long time. Nora was asleep down the hall. The house was the specific quiet of 2 a.m, and I could hear the refrigerator and nothing else. And I thought about Thomas eating breakfast at that table in March. And I thought about 14 years of his work. And I thought about every client call I had answered in the weeks after he died. And then I picked up my phone and I called my attorney. I know it was 2 a.m. My attorney is a woman named Patricia Helms, who I had hired 3 months after Thomas died to help me navigate his estate, contractor license succession, and the question of what happened to business contracts that had his personal license attached to them. And Patricia had told me at our second meeting to call her any time I found something that felt wrong, and she had said it with the specificity of someone who suspected something might feel wrong before I did. I called her at 2 a.m, and she answered on the 4th ring in the voice of someone who was asleep but had decided to be awake, and I read her the registration details from my laptop screen, and there was a pause on the other end, the kind that means someone is processing information and reaching a conclusion at the same time. Patricia said 3 things. First, that using a deceased person's name and identifying information to register a business entity was fraud, specifically identity fraud, and potentially wire fraud if any financial transactions were conducted through the entity. Second, that the contractor license listed on the registration was Thomas's personal license, which had been suspended upon his death and could not be legally transferred to a new entity without going through the estate and the licensing board, meaning any work performed under this business would also be unlicensed contracting, a separate violation. Third, that the grand opening scheduled for the next morning needed to not happen, or needed to happen with a very specific audience in attendance. I asked her what she meant by that. She said that if the grand opening proceeded and clients attended and agreements were made and money changed hands, each of those transactions became a separate instance of fraud built on the foundational fraud of the registration, and that stopping it before it started was significantly cleaner than stopping it after. She asked me whether I wanted to file for an emergency injunction through the courts, which was possible but would take most of the morning to process, or whether there was another avenue. I thought about Thomas's commercial clients, the 3 property management companies, the hotel renovation contractor. I had their contact information. I had been in direct communication with all of them in the months after Thomas's death, because I had been managing the completion of contracted work through his existing crew. I knew their operations managers. I knew the specific people who made decisions about which contractors they used. I said to Patricia, "I think there is another avenue." I spent the next 3 hours sending emails, not angry emails, precise ones. I described the situation in plain language, attaching screenshots of the DFI registration, the Facebook page, and the grand opening announcement, and noting specifically that the registration listed a suspended contractor license and had been filed without the knowledge or consent of the estate. I sent these emails to 4 commercial clients and to the Wisconsin Department of Safety and Professional Services, which oversees contractor licensing, and to the Milwaukee Business Journal's tips email, because Patricia had gently suggested that some situations benefit from the presence of people whose job is to ask questions in public. Then I drove to Victor and Marlene's house at 6 a.m. I want to be honest about why I did it in person rather than through Patricia's office, because the honest answer is not purely strategic. Part of it was strategic. Patricia had advised that confronting them directly before the event gave them an opportunity to voluntarily cancel and potentially cooperate with the estate, which would simplify recovery. But part of it was that these were the people who had sat in my living room 2 weeks after Thomas's funeral and told me they were there for whatever I needed, and something in me needed to look at them when I told them what I had found. Marlene answered the door. She was in a bathrobe, and her expression when she saw me cycled through confusion and then something else, something closer to the expression of someone who has been caught in a hallway they thought was empty. I told her good morning and asked if Victor was home. She said yes and stepped back from the door, and I came inside and stood in their kitchen where I had eaten Christmas dinner and Thanksgiving dinner and birthday dinners for 14 years, and I put my phone on the counter with the DFI registration pulled up, and I turned it so she could read it. Victor came downstairs in the middle of me explaining what I was looking at. He stopped on the third step and did not come down further for a moment, and I understood from that pause that he knew immediately what the conversation was going to be, which told me this was not a misunderstanding that had a simple explanation. He came down. He sat at the kitchen table. Marlene stood near the counter. Craig appeared from the basement door at some point, already dressed, which told me he had been awake preparing for the grand opening, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and did not say anything. Victor told me they had been trying to protect Thomas's legacy, that the business had relationships and employees and momentum that would have been lost if no one acted quickly, that they had not consulted me because I was grieving and they had not wanted to burden me. He said this with the sincerity of someone who had rehearsed it enough times that he had partially convinced himself it was true, and I let him finish the whole of it before I spoke. I told him that Thomas's contractor license was suspended at death and could not be legally attached to a new entity without estate authorization. I told him that I was the estate's administrator and I had not authorized anything. I told him that 3 commercial clients had received emails that morning describing the unauthorized registration and that the Department of Safety and Professional Services had also received a notice. I told him that Patricia Helms, whose card I placed on the table, would be the point of contact for anything related to the business going forward, and that the grand opening needed to be canceled before 10 a.m. Marlene started crying. Craig said something about family pulling together. Victor looked at the business card and then at me with the expression of a man who had not included the possibility of this conversation in any version of the plan he had been running. I said one more thing before I left. I said that Thomas had spent 14 years building something with his name on it, and that his name was still on our daughter's birth certificate and on the deed of the house we had bought together and on the side of a truck in my driveway, and that I was not going to allow it to also appear on a fraudulent business registration that his own father had filed 2 months after his funeral, and that this was not a negotiation. Then I drove home and I called Patricia and I sat at my kitchen table, Thomas's kitchen table, and I waited. The grand opening was canceled. Victor called Patricia's office at 9:47 and told her they were withdrawing the registration and that the event was not proceeding. The DFI registration was voluntarily dissolved the following week, which Patricia confirmed simplified the legal picture considerably, though the dissolution did not undo the filing or the fraudulent use of Thomas's information, and the complaint with the licensing board and the identity fraud report with the state remained active regardless. Thomas's commercial clients responded to my emails that morning, one by one, and every single one said some version of the same thing, which was that they were glad I had told them, that they had not been contacted by anyone claiming to represent a new Kowalski entity, and that when they were ready to engage a flooring contractor again, they would be in touch with me. 3 of them have been in touch since. I have established a working relationship with a licensed contractor who was on Thomas's crew for 6 years, a man named Alexei who knew every client and every job standard Thomas had built his reputation on, and we have completed 2 commercial projects under a properly structured arrangement that I manage administratively the way I always managed Thomas's business. Except now, there is documentation, a proper LLC, a licensed operator, and an agreement that means Nora has an ongoing connection to something her father built rather than a theft of it. The Kowalski family situation is what it is. Victor and Marlene have asked twice through indirect channels, once through Dennis's wife and once through a cousin, whether there is a path toward repairing the relationship. I have not responded to either inquiry, not because I have decided the answer is no, but because I have not finished deciding what the answer is. And I have learned in the past 11 months that decisions made before they are ready, tend to cost more than the time it takes to wait for them. Craig moved out of Victor and Marlene's basement in the fall. I heard this from Sarah, who still occasionally sends me information she thinks I should have, and I am grateful for her in the specific way you are grateful for people who chose accuracy over loyalty to a group narrative. I do not know what Craig is doing now, and I do not need to know. What I think about most, sitting at this kitchen table on the mornings when Nora is at school and the house is quiet, and the light comes in the east window the way it did the morning Thomas was sitting here and then wasn't, is the Google alert. That I had set it up for the small, irrational reason of wanting some mechanism for staying connected to a person who was no longer generating new information, and that it had, 8 weeks after his funeral, returned exactly that, new information, generated by his name being used without his consent, or mine, or any honest claim to his 14 years of work. I think about how different the outcome would have been if I had not set that alert. If I had found out about Kowalski Premier Flooring through a client call 6 months later, after the entity had conducted business and established accounts and built its own version of a record. Documentation is not something you build after the problem appears. It is something you maintain continuously so that when the problem appears, you already have the foundation it needs to be addressed. Thomas kept every job record, every client contract, every material invoice, in labeled folders in a filing cabinet in our garage, not because he had any reason to expect they would be needed in a legal context, but because he was precise about the work he did, and he believed that what was done carefully should be recorded carefully. Those folders are still in that garage. They will stay there. They belong to a 14-year record of a man who built something honestly, and no one gets to attach their name to that record without going through me. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear that grief is not the same as surrender. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.